All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is August the 8th, and today I'm going to be recording this video on the topic of the conjunction between Jupiter and Venus in the sign of Cancer. And I would like to point out, obviously, that I have done some other videos recently about the aspects of the grand air trine and the kite aspects, and it's a pretty hectic time of year for astrology. I have seen some thumbnails floating up on my recommended videos where people are saying it's the worst year for astrology or worst time of the year for astrology. I've also seen some other astrologers doing things about how the shadow of the American chart, which I think is important to consider because it's interesting if you take this transit that we're having and we're putting it next to the American Sibley chart, because America has Venus and Jupiter in Cancer, and it's already happened. America is already past the point of the Jupiter return and the Venus return. And at the time of recording this video, the Jupiter in Cancer is conjunct the America's sun. And there's something about all this where there's another astrologer who I have been watching on and off who has a channel called Collapse Astrology, and I haven't watched it yet, but I've noticed she just put out a video about the shadow of America's chart, which I think largely has to do that if you use Sagittarius rising as the Sibley chart, as most people do, it puts this in the 8th house, which is kind of like a shadowy part of the chart that often has to do with things like crime or addiction or bad stuff or whatever. And there's something about Venus and Jupiter together, which are the two benefics, and they could stand for a lot of positive things. And to give an example, the other day when I was walking my dog, I noticed that some of my neighbors were I live in a fairly multicultural area, and there's a big Indian wedding party going on, right? And I think for the way that this hits my chart, I mean, there's a certain kind of thing where I think some people may have big high hopes and big expectations for what Venus and Jupiter is like, but when it comes to I don't have a lot of cardinal placements, and for this, it kind of makes sense for me to be like, oh, okay, so some people are using this to have a big big Indian wedding party and all this, a big bash, and money's no object, and it's a very Jupiter like spend all your money on, and just a huge blowout kind of thing, right? But this could also have to do with a certain kind of the excesses of an empire in decline, right? Or like a kind of like this kind of shameless indulgence in the way that if you look at myth, Jupiter having all sorts of affairs and liaisons and questionable things or whatever, or that this idea that Jupiter, although it stands for good luck and it stands for providence and things like that, that oftentimes the transits that we experience may not be as just basically positive as we may hope. But I'm still a firm believer that astrology does work, and especially it depends on how it's hitting an individual's chart, what your placements are like, what your life circumstances are like. I do think that Jupiter transits do make stuff happen, but unfortunately, in the midst of everything else going on, the Jupiter in Venus, the biggest aspect they've been making is to Saturn and Neptune and Pisces, which they're already kind of like separating from. Like the orb is getting kind of distant. It's over 10 degrees. So there's this thing going on with this whole dynamic where I tend to sort of look at the recent aspect with the square to Saturn and Neptune in Aries And I was thinking about this in terms of the archetype of the mass movement or whatever, or like um, or like this idea of a certain kind of religious thing with Neptune that lends itself to think about the old traditions of like going to church and congregating with a bunch of, and it's sort of like it's the role of the priest to sort of teach morality to sort of the ignorant, sinful masses, right? Like there's that kind of, and you see a certain resurgence towards like religious traditionalism, stuff like that. But I have to admit, it's just the whole situation right now in terms of like politics, the United States, is obviously a huge mess, right? And there's something about the organizing in terms of like mass protests, which we did see some of that around the 4th of July and the No King's Day and all this kind of stuff. And so it's not like it's not, and apparently there's a lot of protests that are happening that just aren't being reported on as well. So there could be a kind of like obstruction of the media of what is visible, perhaps. But there's some, I'm just kind of I'm trying to introduce this thing that I intend to kind of like get a little bit deeper into with this whole dynamic. And I think one example could be like there's this tendency to organize mass social movements, right? And what I find really interesting about this is that what we see playing out is basically the result of the victory of MAGA as a mass social movement, right? And the thing about like this is kind of like what you describe as the problem of populist politics, right? Is that the mass social movement, when not, if these people are, it's not really the greatest mass social movement, right? Now, there are certain, and the problem about this too is that I think the response or the reaction against this has been, for some reason, it's like you saw certain, if you were going to organize into a mass social movement that would be, let's say, organized, if you saw the whole problem with, let's say, Trump and the implications of a cabal of, global elite predators or whatever, that you could see this as an inherent kind of structural thing around patriarchy and misogyny and violence against women and all this kind of stuff. And what you saw back in the very first election of Trump was that the protest against this organizing itself into like something which quickly was ridiculed of the pink pussy hat thing. Like it was something that was seen as, you had a lot of women that were obviously offended or protesting against this, but it didn't have any real, it was easily something that was just defeated for some reason. And at the same time, you also had the language around like calling somebody a social justice warrior or something like that made into basically a slur or a point of ridicule or something that was not taken seriously. And out of this whole resulting kind of like culture war in which and I'm just saying that there's something out of this too, where it's like in the midst of all this kind of like, I don't know, it's like if you rewind a little bit, I have been reading a book right now. I started reading this. It's like 10 years old, but I started reading this book called Inventing the Future. If you say, it says demand full automation, demand universal basic income, demand the future. This is the book that coined the term gay luxury space communism. And I've only started reading it, but it basically is one of these books that was written in the aftermath of Occupy Wall Street. And there was a lot of the beginning of this book is sort of a criticism of the Occupy Wall Street as a mass movement. And similar, if you go back to that kind of era of like Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, what you saw stuff like social media being used, and the idea of viral hashtag, like the whole kind of concept of something like MAGA was that it was taking this thing that started with the Arab Spring and with Occupy Wall Street as the idea of using social media to form mass like populist movements, and then from that use that to be an actual political force with like a presidential figurehead and stuff like that. And it's where Occupy Wall Street failed, where the Arab Spring failed, MAGA has been able to succeed basically in this whole thing of a mass social movement. But I think there's something about this which there's some kind of thing about the promise of mass social movements have proven themselves only to be appeal to this really basic kind of populism that obviously has just created a big mess for itself, right? And it's also, I was thinking about this whole problem in that there's this, at an archetypal level, I'm thinking you could look at it very simply in the terms of people massing together, either like at church or at a wedding or something like that. The people having big wedding parties and stuff like that. But there's also this underlying dynamic. Forgive me for using the stereotype of East and West, but there's this tendency that I have in my own experience socializing or being in certain friendships or relationships with people of other cultures, that there's this common thing to associate the people who get categorized as Eastern as being more collectively minded, more community minded, and in contrast, the Western. What does the West mean? It basically means the European and the colonizer who has European ancestry is in contrast to the Eastern to be more individualistic, right? And being in the sort of hyper individualized mode, we are alienated and they're full of resentment, basically, right? We're resentful, alienated, frustrated, and somehow it's like the force of the white frustrated colonizer, despite our frustration, that kind of attitude of the decentered majority, or like the majoritarian of like white people who are now frustrated, and it's like all the Eastern people have better wedding parties or something, and we're just alienated and alone and fearful and afraid. But then combine that with the technology that creates social movements, and that instead of having a social movement of social justice warriors or of people against Wall Street, you even out those two forces with something that basically has a mass movement of social rebelliousness that doesn't threaten Wall Street or the elite or the oligarchs, but rather keeps them in power. And I'm actually thinking about all this whole problem, and this is the whole thing of like Venus and Jupiter in just having just recently made a return in the American Sibley chart, right? I've been, and the fact that this is like, there should be some sort of potential for better action in a kind of a mass movement mentality, but there's criticism that of that whole thinking about a mass movement organization as being the answer. And what we really see here is just the end result of that problem, and why our efforts to do that are problematic to begin with. And also, this also, keep in mind, it's really interesting to see that Donald Trump has given himself some sort of king-like power, that if he doesn't like the numbers of the technocrats, he gets to just fire people, right? Don't tell him numbers he doesn't like, or he'll just fire you. Or like if you, he'll come up he'll decide to put tariffs on you and figure out the reason why he's putting tariffs on you later. It doesn't actually matter if his reasoning is attached to, he's got this kind of sovereign power to just do what he wants, regardless of the facts, regardless of the numbers, regardless of whatever people say reality is, right? And with this in mind, I decided Carl Jung in Undiscovered Self, after thinking about this, keep in mind to put both of these together, that I'm kind of going through something right now where I'm not even really sure if I want to invest that much into being into Carl Jung, the archetypes, the myths, and that. I think maybe I should just give in and become a communist, and we should go this direction maybe. But with this in mind, let's listen to Carl Jung and see what he has to say. Okay. Now, keep in mind what has been happening in the United States, where there has been just a wholesale kind of dismissal of climate science, of getting the reports back for the numbers of the economy, of job growth, and of using, or however you're calculating your tariff numbers are somewhat strange and arbitrary. And with this in mind, I think Carl Jung could provide some insight to the situation. So bear with me as I'm going to read a bit from The Undiscovered Self from Carl Jung. Okay. Scientific education is based in the main on statistical truths and abstract knowledge, and therefore imparts an unrealistic, rational picture of the world in which the individual, as merely marginal phenomenon, plays no role. The individual, however, as an irrational datum, is the true and authentic carrier of reality. The concrete man, as opposed to the unreal ideal or normal man to whom the scientific statements refer. What is more, most of the natural sciences try to represent the results of their investigations as though these had come into existence without man's intervention, in such a way that the collaboration of the psyche, an indispensable factor, remains invisible. An exception to this is modern physics, which recognizes that the observed is not independent of the observer. So in this respect as well, science conveys a picture of the world from which a real human psyche appears to be excluded, the very antithesis of the humanities. Under the influence of scientific assumptions, not only the psyche, but the individual man, and indeed all individual events whatsoever, suffer a leveling down and process of blurring that distorts the picture of reality into a conceptual average. We ought not to underestimate the psychological effect of the statistical world picture. It thrusts aside the individual in favor of anonymous units that pile up into mass formations. Instead of the concrete individual, you have the names of organizations, and at the highest point, the abstract idea of the state as the principle of a political reality. The moral responsibility of the individual is then inevitably replaced by the policy of the state, raison d'etat. Instead of moral and mental differentiation of the individual, you have public welfare and the raising of the living standard. Instead of moral and mental differentiation of the individual, you have the public welfare and the raising of the living standard. Well, not in America right now. We basically have a increasingly, a society apparently doesn't care about public welfare or the living standard, and instead of the state having any pretense towards moral superiority, it's all on that responsibility is all placed on the individual. If you want to live in a moral world, it's you as an individual to be like a kind of almost like, what am I going to, You have to create your own reality. If you want to have a moral reality, you have to be a pillar of moral ideals yourself. You can't rely on the state to do that for you, because they're obviously corrupt as all hell. Okay. And they don't care about the living standard. They don't care about doing anything good. It's up to the individual now, right? Because this is the American ideal. This is the American freedom and democracy and individuality, right? Playing out right in front of your eyes. The goal and meaning of individual life, which is the only real life, no longer lie in individual development, but in the policy of the state. Well, not in America. Which is thrust upon the individual from outside and consists in the execution of an abstract idea, or the goal and meaning of individual life, which is the only real life, no longer lie in individual development, but in the policy of the state, which is thrust upon the individual from the outside and consists in the execution of an abstract idea which ultimately tends to attract all life to itself. The individual is increasingly deprived of the moral decision as to how he should live his own life, and instead is ruled, fed, clothed, and educated as a social unit, accommodated in the appropriate housing unit, and is amused in accordance with the standards that give pleasure and satisfaction to the masses. The rulers, in their turn, are just as much social units as the ruled, and are distinguished only by the fact that they are specialized mouthpieces of the state doctrine. They do not need to be personalities capable of judgment, but thoroughgoing specialists who are unusable outside their line of business. State policy decides what shall be taught and studied. The seemingly omnipotent state doctrine is, for its part, manipulated in the name of state policy by those occupying the highest positions in the government, where all the power is concentrated. Whoever by election or caprice gets into one of these positions is subject to no higher authority. He is state policy itself, and within the limits of the situation can proceed at his own discretion. With Louis the 14th, he can say, "L'état c'est moi." He is thus the only individual, or at any rate one of the few individuals, who could make use of their individuality if only they knew how to differentiate themselves from the state doctrine. They are more likely, however, to be slaves of their own fictions. Such one-sidedness is always compensated psychologically by unconscious subversive tendencies. Slavery and rebellion are inseparable correlates. Hence, rivalry for power and exaggerated distrust pervade the entire organism from top to bottom. Furthermore, in order to compensate for its chaotic formlessness, a mass always produces a leader who infallibly becomes the victim of his own inflated ego consciousness, as numerous examples in history show. This development becomes logically unavoidable the moment the individual combines with the mass and thus renders himself obsolete. Apart from the agglomeration of huge masses in which the individual disappears anyway, one of the chief factors responsible for psychological mass-mindedness is scientific rationalism, which robs the individual of his foundations and his dignity. As a social unit, he has lost his individuality and becomes a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics. Not Donald Trump, though. The statistics have no power over him. He's completely individuated from any statistical, numerical validity or reality. He just does his own thing. He doesn't care what the numbers are. He can only play the role of an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. If everything you can do is ruled by the numbers, it doesn't matter who you elect, because the only thing, if we can see that you're like, oh well, hey look, in a few years we're gonna have global warming and climate change that's gonna mess up, and there's all we can do is adapt ourselves to what the numbers say will create the best outcome, then you basically create an eco-fascist authoritarian regime where we have to get the scientists to study the data to learn how fucked we are, and then we don't have any option what to do aside from what's good for the environment, right? And then in the face of this brutal statistical reality, we have a heroic figure who just does what he wants, which is basically to shill out for whoever has the most power, so they can create a kind of crony capitalist oligarch society, basically, right? Because that's obviously the better solution, and we call that freedom and democracy. So anyways, what's going on here? Getting back to the book. As a social unit, he has lost his individuality and has become a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics. He can only play the role of an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. You know, there's also another angle to this too, which is like the numbers of, if you treat human beings who are, how are they being categorized into people who are valid citizens, or are they being categorized into people who are, invading aliens and refugees that need to be taken away and exiled and expunged from society, right? And that at some basic level, a human being is beyond like statistical, mathematical importance. They're their own being that goes beyond how you label them and categorize them. And as we've seen, how this whole pretense towards the statistical certainty is often just a mask or a cover for prejudice. In the same way that, let's say, when it comes to credit ratings, there's been a history of people of minority groups being systematically given worse credit ratings just because they come from a certain ethnic group, right? And that you're giving a better credit rating because these hidden prejudices that are then masked as statistical information, right? That there's value judgments in the statistical information that we can only take responsibility for as the individuals who are controlling, working the gears of these technocratic systems, right? And that we may use the veneer of a kind of technocratic objective neutrality, but then completely corrupt that with our own unexamined bias, which is basically our own succumbing to our own blind spot and claiming we have objective statistical certainty when we may be coding this whole system with our prejudices, right? And you just have to look at what Elon Musk is trying to do with Grok AI for a good example of this, right? He can only play the role of an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. Looked at rationality, and from the outside, that is exactly what he is. Looked at rationally from the outside, that is what he is. Just a unimportant dot, just a statistic, just another number, who has no individual agency. You're just a statistic to get pushed around. Somebody's going to turn some lever, they're going to manipulate you with some algorithm, and your behavior will be easily controlled, and the numbers go this way, that way, based on what the controllers want you to do, basically. From this point of view, it seems positively absurd to go on talking about the value or meaning of the individual. Indeed, one can hardly imagine how one ever came to endow individual human life with so much dignity when the truth to the contrary is as plain as the palm of your hand. Seen from this standpoint, the individual really is of diminishing importance, and anyone who wished to dispute this would soon find himself at a loss for arguments. And this could be like what Carl Jung saw as the diminishing importance of the individual that what we see in Trump is like a kind of a last stand for American individuality, right? The one lone individual who's just flying in the face of every kind of collectively agreed upon fact or statistic or number. You just have one man who gets to individually be above it all, right? And as the resistance of the individual to the numerical machine, right? As some heroic defiance against numerical reality. The fact that the individual feels himself or the members of his family or the esteemed friends or in his circle to be important merely underlines the slightly comic subjectivity of his feeling. For what are the few compared with 10,000 or 100,000, let alone with 1,000,000? This recalls the argument of a thoughtful friend with whom I once caught up in a huge crowd of people. Suddenly he exclaimed, "Here you have the most convincing reason for not believing in immortality, that lot wants to be immortal." And now you could take that and then apply that to the oligarch tech bros who literally want to be immortal, right? I mean, rather than the crowd, you now have the elites that are rising up, think that they're above the crowd, and what a bunch of clowns they look like, right? Anyways, the bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and impotence, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which, after all, is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of living, then he is already on the road to state slavery and, without knowing or wanting it, has become its proselyte. The man who looks only outside and quails before the big battalions has nothing with which to combat the evidence of his senses and his reason. But that is just what is happening today. We are all fascinated and overawed by statistical truths and large numbers and are daily apprised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, since it is not represented and personified by any mass organization. You know, this is also kind of reminds me of the recent game show by Mr. Beast, where it's just like trying to take the concept and how many numbers of people can you apply it to, and like how can you show off what a huge mass, whereas the individual, and kind of just, if there's any sort of individual personal drama, it's just sort of these people are like little ants that are so insignificant in just like the huge scale of how massive everything is, right? That's kind of conversely, those personages who strut about on the world stage and whose voices are heard far and wide seem to the uncritical public to be borne along some mass movement or on the tide of public opinion, and for this reason are either applauded or execrated. Since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, it remains a moot point whether their message is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they are merely function as the megaphone for collective opinion. Under these circumstances, it is small wonder that the individual judgment grows increasingly uncertain of itself, and that the responsibility is collectivized as much as possible, i.e. is shuffled off by the individual and delegated to a corporate body. In this way, the individual becomes more and more a function of society, which in its turn usurps the function of the real life carrier, whereas in actual fact, society is nothing more than an abstract idea like the state. This is, again, kind of proto-Margaret Thatcherism. There is no such thing as society. It's just an abstract idea. But I think the state is more than an abstract idea, because I think the state guarantees your American dollar is stable because it is created by a state which guarantees a certain degree of stability. And if that is sort of undermined, and then your whole your mode of market economy and all this stuff goes under, I think that the state, the market needs the state to create a currency to trade with, and the whole principle of no government and just lots of, just a totally unhinged market state is kind of crazy, perhaps, in my opinion, anyways. And that's why I'm leaning in the other direction, perhaps. But both are hypostatized, that is, have become autonomous. The state, in particular, is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is expected. So now this is like we basically have the opposite of this in the America. Now, instead of the state being its own quasi-animate personality from which you expect everything, now you actually have some crazy individualistic personality that is trying to if you were somebody who is at all dependent on the state for some kind of social assistance or even to create jobs, you actually can't expect anything from the state, because now you just have a egomaniacal narcissist dictator who is unbeholden to any expectations of what a head of state should do or should look like, and has become, as you will see, Carl Jung is kind of predicting this here, right? The state in particular is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is expected. In reality, it is only a camouflage for those individuals who know how to manipulate it. Thus, the constitutional state drifts into the situation of a primitive form of society, the communism of a primitive tribe where everybody is subject to the autocratic rule of a chief or an oligarchy. Ta-da! Okay, too bad if you wanted to have any sort of accountability. Now we just have a kind of barbarian chieftain and a bunch of oligarchs who get to do what they want, and that is completely, because they're individuals, because these are self-actualized individuals, they are completely unbeholden to what the numbers are. If there are certain scientists say that if you do this and that and the other thing, it will create a very bad situation for the whole world in terms of climate catastrophe, they don't even care. They can just fire everybody whose numbers they don't like and do what they want because they're individuals. We've created the ultimate individualistic society where we can just destroy the world if we want to, because we don't care, because we're individuated from the whole fucking reality that creates us in a kind of complete kind of governmental psychosis, basically. What a wonderful time to be alive. And happy Jupiter return, America. You've really done a wonderful job with this one. I'm sure that you'll have a very, if anybody tells you to moderate your indulgences, to live, to sort of conform to certain social standards, those people are just trying to oppress you with the massive groupthink of herd morality, and it's the real people who succeed in society don't let anybody tell them what to do, and so you just indulge like crazy and do whatever you want, have fun, tune in for next time. Okay, thanks for watching.